So in the game Disciples of YouTube, I played as Nazca with a Mictlin teammate, and I'm going to, before we get into the game itself, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Nazca itself, how the new bless system actually completely changed how Nazca is played, and then just go over Pretender design for a little bit before actually going over the Pretender that we went with and the turns themselves. I'm just going to go over the lineup real quick. So this is our capital-only Super Mage, the Royal Malky. We're going to be recruiting a couple of these for site searching. Probably just one or two for that purpose. And then any extras that we get are basically going to be caused by us just having so much excess gold that we can afford to dump the gold into a reanimator, which is what happened in this game that I'm playing, but I don't expect to be happening in the Disciple game. Koyas we're actually not going to be getting in spite of the fact that they're pretty excellent mages, because if an Inca dies, then it randomly is going to kill a Koya as well. These guys basically have like a shared mummification trait, where if one of them dies, it sacrifices another in order to combine them to form a Royal Malky. Incas are going to be our go-to capital mage just because they are flying Holy 3 leaders, and we're going to be needing that a lot. So these guys are going to be basically summoning or casting Divine Blessing on our massive flocks of Condors in order to make sure that all of them are blessed during fights, because if we're doing any way half close to decent, we're going to be having way too many of them for a conventional blessing to be able to keep up with. These guys are theoretically thuggable because they've got awe and above average hit points and halfway decent attack and defense, but we're not really taking a bless that's aimed at that, and we're probably not going to be in that situation just because these guys are going to be too valuable, just as our big priests. Additionally, because of their past, they can summon full-size elementals, which is also pretty useful. And then when they die, they mummify, and that means that they become a Royal Malky who can then reanimate Supayas forever. So these guys are basically great because even when you lose them, like even if everything goes wrong and the Inca dies, he's still incredibly valuable for your nation just because he can constantly produce the Sacreds. Our next most useful guy is the Hurin Priest. These guys are going to be most of what we're going to be getting from outside of our capital. Because they have decent base research, even in Drain 3 they're going to be researching okay at 10 RP. Obviously that's not gold efficient at 235 gold, but with Drain you kind of have to make do with what you can. Additionally, they actually do have pretty useful battle magic. So a third of them are going to be Earth 2. That's going to be just generally useful because it opens up Earth power into Earth 3 stuff, including summoning size 6 Earth Elementals, Strength of Giants, which is going to further increase the damage of all of our Sacreds, Legions of Steel to help make our recruitable guys a little bit tankier, Marble Warriors to help give protection to, well, everything. With Earth Boots and Earth 4, after summon Earth power, they can even be spending a gem in order to cast Weapons of Sharpness, which is also incredibly valuable in the late game in making our modest damage Sacreds be able to pierce even the heaviest armor. The Astro Random guys can Communion up for good stuff, and the Air Random guys actually are going to be really useful in the late game because of the Death Air Crosspass spells. So Wailing Winds is the big one, which basically is casting fear across the entire battlefield, but Wind of Death is also really great as a suicide spell. Like all of the other Nazcan mages that are birds, they have a Mummify trait. When these guys become mummies, the mummies can only reanimate just regular undead because they're not Holy 3, but they also have innate spellcaster, which means that they are going to be constantly spamming spells pretty well once you bring them to fights. And they're also inspirational and have a huge amount of undead leadership, so they're actually pretty nice for dragging your Supayas around. They're less mobile, though, which is also actually pretty important, so we'll probably be having Hurin Priests leading Supayas for the most part. Additionally, Malky Priests and Hurin Priests, because they're both Death 2 mages, can, at the very worst case, always be relied upon for skeleton spamming, which is just, generally good. We're probably not going to be recruiting very much of these guys, which are our heretics. Theoretically, if we could absolutely spam these heretics, then we could avoid the worst of our dominion by just keeping it low, but that's not really something that we can rely on, since by the time you have any decent numbers of them out, your scales have already been applied, so it's really just not something we're going to be using a lot of. Fortune Teller is going to help make up for our running Heavy Misfortune, and these guys are Earth and Nature mages, which is occasionally kind of useful. Like I mentioned, though, we're probably not going to be recruiting many of those, in large part just because they're gold. They cost gold, and gold is going to be super valuable for us. The only other, the only other two units worth really mentioning, I guess, out of Nazca's roster that are non-sacred are the Hatun Runas and the Spearmen. So the Spearmen, in spite of their name, are actually Lancers, which means that they have a charge bonus for the first strike, meaning that they're dealing 17 piercing damage on the initial attack. So while these guys aren't super impressive in any sense, they've got pretty okay attack, defense, strength, and so on. Very mediocre protection, and just normal morale. They are flying, and they have lances, so that means that they can join in the Alpha Strike with all of our blobs of Sacreds. So if we're not already completely surrounding our opponents with our Sacred Strike, these guys can help deal a little bit more damage on the first hit. Hatun Runas are, they're slave units. They have 7 base morale. They have no real protection, poor attack. They're basically militia. But they are flying, they are not undisciplined, and they cost 5 gold. So that means that you can absolutely spam these guys out, especially since they have only 3 resources and 2 recruitment points. And then you can use them basically as siege chaff and fort stuffers. Additionally, all of the Malkies, including the ones that can't reanimate undead, can capture these guys for free. You still pay upkeep on them, of course, but because they're slaves and cost only 5 gold, the upkeep is pretty negligible. So basically, with Condors, you have a siege bonus. With these guys, you have the ability to stuff your own forts to prevent them from being stormed, and provide additional bodies for breaching enemy forts if your absolutely massive swarms of Condors are not enough to do that already. So Nazca is both incredibly difficult to actually take forts from, and it can take your forts very quickly. Because everything flies, they can spread across your territory very quickly. Because they can absolutely spam out Sacreds, they can outnumber you, and because they don't really need anything aside from just, air gems and dead Malki priests to get their Sacreds, they basically scale very well because they can get ever larger numbers of Sacreds as the game goes on. So the new Bless system is most important for Nazca, mostly just because it opens up the air path, which lets Nazca take advantage of one of their stronger spells, which they didn't really get to use effectively in Dominions 4. So Summon Condors is a spell with some pretty incredible scaling. It summons 10 Condors at base, and then 2 for every additional level of the caster for only 9 air gems. And Condors are sacred. So while their stats are not particularly impressive individually, they do have 2 attacks each, and they are size 3, meaning that you wind up with 4 attacks per square. And then they also have a massive patrol bonus and a fairly sizable siege bonus, which means that they're actually fairly effective as utility summons. Additionally, they're stealthy, with an insane stealth score, so they essentially don't add to the stealth penalty of the commander. So that means that if you do manage to get stealthy commanders with, say, Shademail Halberjon, which Nazca has the paths to forge, then you can sneak these guys around as well. Most importantly, though, they are just absolutely massable at only Conjuration 3, and because they're sacred, you can basically just get swarms of Sacreds out very quickly. Now, in Dominions 4, you were basically gated by Bless availability, so while you were definitely going to be able to spam out these Supayas, with Condors you would probably only be summoning them with your Air 2 mages, and you would typically take a Bless that works well with your Supayas. Now, Supayas were also buffed in the Dominions 4 to Dominions 5 transition, in part because the Spectral Spear now is magic resistance check for half damage, rather than magic resistance check for no damage. Supayas have always had pretty decent stats with good attack and defense scores, and while their HP is middling and their protection is essentially non-existent, they're still absolutely spammable ethereal summons, which you get at 2 per turn from any Holy 3 priest, or with reanimation, or 4 per turn once you forge the Huaka headdress, which is one of Nazca's national items. So as a result, you basically have 2 different ways of massing sacred summons before you even get to their recruits. And their recruits are okay. They have 2 different recruitable sacreds, neither of which are particularly impressive. These guys have light lances and flying storms, which is actually pretty nice because it means that there's less that can get in their way, and if you can bring them underwater, they fly there as well. And then they have decent map move as well. Then they have a very slightly slower bodyguard summon with sun maces, which are magic weapons, which deal a fair bit more damage, and deal triple damage against undead and demons. So these guys are really incredible against any elite undead like Wraiths, Tartarians, and so on. But against normal opponents, the Condor Warrior is actually slightly better, just based on the fact that the lances are going to be dealing piercing damage, and because they fly in storms, unless of course you need them to have the magic weapons. In terms of their base damage, light lances are actually dealing the same amount of damage on the first strike, I believe. No, actually, they deal 2 more damage on the first strike than the maces do, but less damage on every subsequent hit. So against low protection targets, the Sun Guards are actually going to be better in general. Sun Guards also have slightly better protection, but like I mentioned, also slightly lower map move and higher encumbrance, thanks to the fact that they have slightly heavier armor. So those are essentially the 4 sacred units which Nazca is going to be using, but if you're taking a bless, it's most likely going to be for the Condors and the Supayas. So in Dominions 4, you are basically going to be taking something like Water 9, Blood 9, or some similar heavy bless that essentially is going to basically help make these guys more survivable and punish people who are trying to kill them, and possibly increase the damage of all of your sacreds. But you couldn't really take an air bless just because the air blesses were kind of bad on your units. Since all of the sacreds fly, you typically want something that's going to be primarily offensive focused, or something that's going to work well with a huge number of sacreds. But then the air bless was introduced, and or the new bless system, I guess, in general was introduced, which opened up a bunch of more options. So this is what I would consider probably the strongest Nazca build for solo games. Unfortunately, it's not available in Disciple games because the chassis that's used, the Frostfather, is unfortunately just not available at all as a Pretender God. So with this build, you basically get major fire resistance, which is extremely helpful for your sacreds in surviving against fire elementals and other sources of fire shield. Because Condors have a length 0 attack, they definitely would take full damage from that with every attack that they make. Thunder Weapons is basically the core of what makes the new Nazca build work. Because it involves taking Air 7 on your god, it basically means that you can summon 20 Condors for every 9 air gems, which is insane. It's just a huge number of sacreds, all of which have 2 attacks, and all of which are flying with fairly high speed, and then they're cruising around the map, basically just instantly breaching forts that they hit, and then with this bless they're also dealing a fair amount of damage. Thunder Weapons basically means that they're going to be dealing armor negating damage, including both some regular damage and some fatigue damage every hit. Additionally, because this is shock damage, it's going to be giving them a chance to paralyze their opponents anytime that they hit them. So unless you're up against a lightning-resistant opponent, Thunder Weapons is basically going to help lock them down. With quickness, you're basically doubling the number of attacks that they're getting, in addition to increasing their already pretty decent attack, and increasing their defense. If you noticed from earlier, Supayas have a very high base defense score, which means that the additional defense from quickness makes them very hard to kill in melee as well. The most important part, of course, is the fact that they're moving and attacking twice, which both means that they're going to be dealing significantly more damage, just, from the increased number of attacks, and having a higher chance to lock down their opponents with the shock damage from the Thunder Weapons. Strength of the Earth is basically just to help make up for the relatively low base damage from both of the sacred summons. Because the Supayas are going to be dealing half damage anytime you succeed on a magic resistance check, even though they're dealing piercing damage, they're not going to be dealing full damage very often, which means that high protection and high magic resistance targets just aren't going to take all that much damage. Having the additional +4 strength basically helps make up for that by a fair bit, and it also means that when things do fail against their magic resistance check, they get absolutely murdered. And then the same is true to a lesser extent for the Condors. They just don't have a huge amount of base damage, because they're not using any weapons, so something that increases the damage of that attack is also going to help kill their targets more quickly, especially if we're up against targets with lightning resistance. And Fate Weaving is really what ties this all together. So it's a little bit difficult to explain what the exact effect is, but essentially it means that your opponents are going to have worse luck, which translates to having worse rolls. So basically anytime that they're going to be taking a protection roll, they're going to have a penalty to that. Now, the interesting thing here is that this also applies to the resistance check against the Thunder Weapons. So that means, because Thunder Weapons always roll a damage roll, which is basically just going to be reduced by the shock resistance of their target, having Fate Weaving essentially is increasing their Thunder Weapon damage from only 1 armor negating damage in terms of physical damage to almost, so I think like 2d7 or 2 to 7 damage on average, which is huge because it means with 5 lightning resistance they're going to be taking damage pretty regularly, and even with 10 they're occasionally going to be getting hits in. And then the same is, because they've got two separate rolls, that means you have two different chances to crit, which Fate Weaving is helping with. Against non-thunder resistant targets, this tiny amount of damage goes just way, way up. And then the same is true for their large numbers of relatively low damage attacks. So the large numbers of attacks from the Condors and the relatively feeble attacks from the Supayas are all going to be benefiting from this Fate Weaving. And then, of course, it also means that they're more likely to be hitting their rolls. It only works after the opponents do have a chance to attack them once, but because you have absolute swarms of Sacreds at various stages of the game, you have lots of different chances to get that Fate Weaving thing going off, just because even if the outermost layer dies, you have more and more Sacreds coming in from behind them to continue dealing damage. So, because Summon Condors is available at Conjuration 3, and your Pretender has all of these magic paths, you're actually going to be able to research up to that very quickly, meaning that you're going to be hitting your power spike extremely quickly, and then in the game that I just showed you, I was even able to summon Condors during the expansion phase to help me expand, even before fighting other players. This is the Pretender God that we ended up going with for our team. The reason that we went with a Nazca Pretender and a Mictlan Disciple was for a couple of reasons. The first and perhaps most important reason is that the Condors come online only after Nazca hits Conjuration 3. This means that you want the Pretender God to be researching for Nazca, because it's going to basically have a lot more paths than you could possibly take on a Disciple, meaning it's going to just have a lot more base research. Additionally, the Stone Huaca is really good at carrying the Bless that you guys want. Because it can get the Air 7, it's going to be able to summon up the Condors fairly well, and then of course it also still has enough points available for most of the Bless that we're looking for. Unfortunately, Fate Weaving isn't actually accessible on this chassis while still taking major fire resistance, because even without any Dominion increase at all, in order to afford major fire resistance, Thunder Weapons, Quickness, and the Strength of the Earth, we basically wind up with a lot fewer points. So this is the other one we were looking at, with basically dumping this to get Fate Weaving. The reason that we ended up not going with this is basically we hadn't really placed as much value on Fate Weaving yet, and we couldn't really find a good use for all the extra points, whereas the +8 strength just felt always good. It was something that basically is always going to be online. It's something that's going to help both the Mictlan and the Nazca dudes just deal lots of damage in the early game, and more importantly, it helps them when they're in very small numbers. So the Strength Bless is basically always functioning, unlike, say, Blood Surge, which requires them to kill something, and Fate Weaving, which requires them to be attacked back, meaning that small numbers of Sacreds diving onto the backlines of the enemy are going to be dealing their extra damage right away. And this is something that we placed a lot of value in, just like the Alpha Strike of having our Flying Sacreds instantly kill targets, both to help with survivability during expansion, since obviously if your Sacreds require being attacked, then, and you don't have any defense bless, then you're going to lose some just due to natural attrition while you're expanding. The reason that the fire resistance portion of our bless is important and isn't something that we can discard in order to be able to afford Fate Weaving is that without fire resistance, fire shields basically hard counter the masses of length 0 weapon Sacreds, because they'll just basically kill themselves extremely quickly against anything with sufficiently high prot and a fire shield, or even just a sufficiently massed number of things that have fire shields. So it basically is just opening yourself up to getting hard countered if you don't have that resistance in place. So when you have this Pretender on Nazca, then you basically have the high air path, which is very, very difficult to take on a Disciple that can also expand. And then you have more research and so on. Meanwhile, Mictlan also has a pretty great chassis to go with this in the form of the Hun Balam. So that's a Jaguar Disciple, which basically brings a bunch of mini Sacred Jaguars with it into battle. Because this is a fully offensive bless, it doesn't help a giant monster quite as much as it does help out like a bunch of massed smaller dudes, and because those Jaguars still have a fairly high attack density and fairly high combat speed, it basically makes the Hun Balam actually really scary, because it's bringing with it a pack of things that all have these Thunder Weapons Quickness and this huge strength bonus. Having 7 Dominion is also pretty nice for Mictlan, just because it means that he can mass a large number of Eagle Warriors. Eagle Warriors are dirt cheap, even with Turmoil 3 and Sloth 3. You can basically get up to your Dom score out of any fort at any given time, assuming that you have the gold and infrastructure to be able to afford them. Heat is also nice on Mictlan because it actually prefers the heat scale. So because our nations have like opposed temperature preferences, Mictlan is actually benefiting somewhat from having heat. Obviously, no one wants to have these 3 scales dumped, but it's something that lets us afford this absolutely staggeringly massive bless, and both Nazca and Mictlan can actually play okay with terrible scales. While MA Mictlan is actually going to be spreading the scales, unlike EA and LA, it's still going to be able to get more out of the bless, in spite of the fact that its scales are trashed, just by overexpanding and hopefully being able to rush someone down. Nazca, meanwhile, scales up naturally with its bless without actually needing to rely on recruitables all that much. While Nazca actually does have pretty decent mages, it's going to be able to basically continuously summon masses of Condors starting from like mid to late way through year 0. So like even before year 1 happens, we're already summoning 20 sacreds per turn in addition to the sacreds that we're recruiting. And then as the game goes on, we're actually going to be increasing that number through the use of the Supaya factories in the forms of those Malkeys that we'd seen. Now, as far as research priorities go, obviously the first step is going to be Conjuration 3 for those Condors. Typically, you can actually go all the way down to Conjuration 5 for full-size fire and air elementals as well. That's going to, and then of course you also have full-size earth elementals from your Malky priests. That also gets you summoned Huacas, which are summonable in decent quantities for Astral Pearls, so it basically gives us another gem which we can convert into Sacreds. It also lets us spend Death Gems on Supayas, but we probably won't be doing that all that much, even with, or we might do that somewhat just to take advantage of our Ginormous Bless, but usually this is less efficient than just reanimating them constantly. And while you do pay upkeep on those Malky Priests, it's still pretty good. Enchantment also is going to be pretty great once we get Horde of Skeletons, just because all of our any fort mages, like our mainline battle mages, have death too. And then, yeah, so in the early game, we're basically going to be just having our recruitable sacreds with a turbo bless, because, you know, that's what you do when you have a massive bless. As the game goes on, you're going to be relying more and more on summons to make up your armies, because, you know, your pretender summons 20 of them every turn. And eventually you're going to be transitioning into Swarms of Supayas with their elite stats, I mean, you know, these guys are ethereal, these guys are free in terms of upkeep cost. Well, these guys do cost upkeep, I suppose. And with the massive bless that we're packing, they're actually going to be very effective offensively as well. Nazca is, in my honest opinion, kind of overpowered right now, based strictly on the fact that Condors remove the penalty that Turbo Blessed nations typically face in terms of being able to actually just afford large numbers of Sacreds, and the Supayas basically remove the scaling penalty that Turbo Blessed nations typically face, because as the game goes on, you just get more and more of these Sacreds being constantly reanimated. The main downside of our team is, as my teammate put it, we have a malice to our banter. If we lose the game, we lost in spite of having a kind of overpowered nation in our roster, and if we win the game, we don't have much to brag about because we're playing with a pretty overpowered team. But I mean, you know, we're playing against decent players, so there's no guarantee that we'll just be able to run people over just based on the strength of our Sacreds. But we should have pretty decent matchup against pretty much any nation, because Nazca's just that good.